Hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about sacred rites. Now, we've talked about sacred space and sacred times already, but now I'd like to talk about sacred rites, which are those protocols, procedures, incantations, movements, all the things that one goes through in their approach to the divine, in their approach to God, in order to entreat the desired result. And the result, desired result typically is just that continued close relationship with God. But nevertheless, we all do them. Sacred rites are something that we all do, and whether or not we acknowledge it. And I came from a tradition that would sometimes say, well, I have a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't need all those rituals. Now, I understand the sentiment behind that. I do. We all, our relationship with God is very personal, and it would be short-sighted not just to admit that sometimes in our life experience, God seems to customize our experience in such a way as to remind us that we are not being lost in the shuffle, that indeed He cares about us specifically. And I get that. But that personal relationship, though, it doesn't negate the fact that we all go through some sort of procedures or protocols when we are approaching God. I've been in settings where people deny this and they say, no, we don't do any rituals or protocols in order to approach God. And I understand that. Now, when I did this experiment, I was teaching at a Bible college at the time, and I said, okay, oh, whoops, sorry. Typically, we start the class with prayer. So if we could, let's all pray. And everyone stopped and closed their eyes and bowed their head. Up, there we go. Sacred rites, protocols and procedures that we all typically do as a habit of reverence, as a way of approaching God in a way, because, well, people will ask, does God need our rituals or do we? Well, I typically find the pursuit of that answer to be unhelpful because first of all, I'm not going to assert that God needs anything. He's completely self-contained. He's completely self-sufficient. He doesn't need anything at all. So it's not like He needs our rites and rituals. But I will say this, it is not obvious at all that I am personally constituted in a way that I can approach God in my right mind in any given moment. Typically, I am very much in need of procedures and protocols and practices that put me in my right mindset. And if that's true of just one individual, how much more so when everyone is gathered together? So both in official and popular religion, we typically tend to go through certain rites and rituals as part of our sacred rites in approaching God. Families say grace when they're just around the house, around their dinner time at home. Many do so at restaurants. Oftentimes, people will still think of clasping their hands and closing their eyes and bowing their head as part of a prayer. On an individual level, that takes place, but how much more so at the macro level when we are gathered together? And like I said, I came from a tradition that would say, well, we don't believe in all that ritual, all the while being highly ritualized. And so and you think about it, any given worship service is like this. I was asked years ago by a Muslim scholar who was trying to, as an outsider, understand Christianity. He was helping me understand Islam, and so we had a really good exchange back and forth this way. But he was helping me understand Islam. He wanted to understand Christianity, and he said, how many different branches of Christianity are there? Now, those who understand the proliferation of denominations would look at that, scratch their head, and think, oh boy, how am I going to answer that? Well, I told him, well, on the fly, I said, well, there's basically two. And if you classify them by their sacred rites, because what you have is, if you could line graph, a Christian worship service with the horizontal axis being the duration of it and the vertical axis being meaning, not every part of the service is as meaningful as every other part. For example, the least meaningful part is going to be when you just first walk in the door. That's going to be your introductory rites. That's going to be certain initiatory rites that just kind of get you in where you're beginning the flow of the service. And then there's going to be preparatory rites and intermediate rites that happen along the way, all in preparation for, as that grows in meaning, that apex rite. And the apex rite is that point of greatest meaning in the service. And then you have your concluding rites after that. Well, This is when if you classify Christianity based upon that ritual line graph, they fall into two categories. One where the apex rite is a oral presentation. We oftentimes call it the sermon, and the other is the apex rite is the symbol of bread and wine, often referred to as communion or Eucharist. The idea is that in one, the apex rite is persuasive, it is spoken, it appeals to the mind. And the mind, in many ways, the heart. Whereas in the second category, the apex rite is symbol, it's mystery, it is inexplicable. It infuses and compresses together far too many things you know to be true that can be spoken in any given time. Otherwise, it just becomes clumsy. So you take all of that theology, all that history, all of the things you understand about Jesus Christ from the Bible, and you compress that into something that then you can hand to someone. Well, that is, and if you think I'm going to get into exactly how theologians have treated that in the past, you're crazy. I'm not going to get into that right now. But I will say this. We all do sacred rites. All of us do it. None are exempt. And what happens is that typically when you go to, when you're part of a church, you become part of that. You assimilate into that. It becomes part of the unspoken things you just know. And sacred rites are something that we all do in the rest of our lives. We tend to ritualize everything from the mundane to the highly important. Consider commencement exercises at the end of graduating from a high school or a college. Think about our weddings. Think about occasional sacred rites that happen for rites of passage or ways in which we initiate someone into a new walks of life. We're always ritualizing just about anything that we find meaningful at all. I mean, and again, far too many things to list here, but just the ways in which we engage in rituals that are for things that we find meaningful. Again, funerals, weddings, quinceañeras, gender reveal parties for people that are expecting a child. We ritualize everything. And so to the extent that we ever think that we are exempt when it comes to our relationship with God, we're oftentimes in denial. So think about this, the ways in which the sacred rites of your worship experience, engage them, think about them, dive into them. Don't just coast along. Consider all the symbolisms and all the ways in which it's pregnant with meaning along the way, and then maybe you could take a full advantage of it. All right, that's all I have for now. Have a blessed day.